So let's go ahead and switch this from Blender Render to Cycles and create a new material for this cube, which we can do straight from the material panel here. Press New, or of course you can do that straight from the node editor. Then we'll need a texture image, so you can either press Shift A to bring up the add menu, or just double right click as you would in the 3D view to bring up the add menu. And under texture here, we just add an image texture. Then we're going to connect this color output socket of this image texture node to this color input of this diffuse node. And next we'll need to load an image into this image texture node. The images we're going to be using today are from the free seamless elemental sample brush pack you can get at blendersensei.com. So if I open up my browser, head over to blendersensei.com, go to the store page here. There's this free seamless elemental brush pack you can download if you don't already have that downloaded. And I'm going to head over to my desktop and just unzip that. And so here's this folder of seamless texture images. These texture images are half resolution of the pack of 300 seamless elemental brush pack you can get at blendersensei.com, but they're still really useful either as brushes, which you can load directly into ZeroBrush, or as just regular seamless repeating texture images to use on your objects. Okay, so there's those. Now all we need to do is load one of those into this image texture. So I'm going to press open and head over to my desktop, which I've got bookmarked here, which by the way, if you want to bookmark things, you just press this little plus sign here by where it says bookmarks whenever you are in a certain folder. So here on my desktop, I've got the seamless elemental brush pack. I'm just going to select this wallstone castle here. And so now that image has been loaded into this texture. So one last task remains, the same as in Blender Render. Your objects using texture images need to be UV mapped. Because this object is real simple, we can just press Tab to go into edit mode, and we can either just press U and select Unwrap from the unwrapping menu, or if you prefer, you can use the tool shelf, press T, and click on our edge tools here in edit mode, and you can select Unwrap from this Unwrap drop-down menu. So once we do that, we can see down here in the camera view the image texture now on the object. But in our big 3D view right now, we are in solid viewport shading, and we want to switch that to material viewport shading. So we can either do that directly from here, or you can just press Alt-Z. And so now we can see that image texture on our object here in the Cycles render engine. We can either press our render preview down here and see this show up during a Cycles render preview, or we can just press Shift-Z while in the main 3D viewport. So we've got an image on there, that's great and all, but it's looking pretty plain. So we could add some nodes to this image and spice things up. So I'm going to press Shift-Z to get out of that render preview. And we could switch this to the node editor, or we could just go to the dedicated shader workspace, which has a node editor open by default. We can press this button to zoom in on the particular materials nodes here. So we could add some bump mapping to this by entering a value for this displacement value of this material output. So what we would want to do is get this color information from this image texture to this displacement, where we typically run normal mapping, bumping type things into our Cycles materials. But this color socket output of this node is yellow and this input is gray, which means it wants to take in black and white information. So what we got to do is convert the color from the image texture to black and white. And to do that, we can, under converter here, use RGB to BW, which just means from color to black and white. So we run this color value of this image texture into here, and then we output this RGB to BW to this displacement of this master material output node that everything has to funnel into. And now if we press render preview, we have a displacement value for our texture. Okay, so there's a few things going on as to why we can't see this displacement value very well. You can definitely see a difference if I hold Control and then cut this link here by left clicking. You can see that immediately change there when I do that. But first of all, the lighting here, this solid white background, does not aid much in being able to see a lot of detail in our material. So we could turn render preview off there, and under lights, turn on quick lights here, which will give us more feedback information. And another thing going on is that this material has no way of showing anything reflective or any kind of specular surface. So what we need to do is give it the ability to reflect light a little bit with a glossy node. So let's double right click and under shader add a glossy node here. And we're going to need to mix this glossy and diffuse. And of course, diffuse just means basic color, which its color information is coming from this image here. We're going to need to mix these two and let them funnel into this master output surface here. So we also need a mix shader here. And so we need to run the glossy into the mix shader and the diffuse into the mix shader, and then the output of the mix shader into the surface. And so immediately, if I turn my render preview on now, we can see a lot of shiny things starting to manifest across our material here. So we've got this factor value which controls which of these nodes get the most influence on what comes out here and goes into the surface. We drag it to the far left, it's giving all the influence to this glossy node. If we drag it to the far right, it's giving all the influence to just the basic color information coming from that image texture. So we want it to mostly be just affected by the color information, but we want a little bit of glossy to be able to get in there to work with that displacement bump map to allow it to actually make things pop off a little bit. We can also control the roughness value of this glossy node, and we can gain even more control over our displacement bump value that we've created here by adding a math node. So what I'm going to do is pull this RGB to VW, this color to black and white basically, down so that I can use this math node under converter as basically a dial, just sort of turn it up or down. So we want to switch this to multiply. Now if we press render preview again, we can dial this value up, make this bumpier and bumpier and bumpier, and we can dial this value down. Or we can dial it all the way into the negative value, which gives us the inverse effect of the displacement. Let's set this to about 0.125 here, and maybe give a little bit more influence onto the glossy side of things. Okay, we can also do things like control the brightness and contrast, the color values of our image. If we use nodes found under the color category of nodes here, such as this hue saturation here, we could select this, and we could drop this between where the image texture is running to the diffuse shader here, and I'll pull that back a little bit so we can see this a little better. We can adjust the saturation, make that more saturated like that, or we can change the actual color by adjusting this hue value here. We can adjust this value here, which gives us more control over the brightness of the color. We could also, if we wanted to have more Photoshop-like controls over this material, we could double right click and under color, we could add bright and contrast. So you could directly have control over that as well. So we could increase the contrast up on this, or the brightness, or bring that brightness down, and what have you. Maybe a bit more direct color control over our image rather than using this hue saturation node. If we click on this and we just press X, this will delete the node, but keep the link where it was coming and going here. So we could press X to delete that, and we could replace it with a mix RGB. And so what this will do is it will let the original color information image texture come in here, and then it let us manually set this, using a slider to whatever we want. So we could change the color more directly like this, and then switch this to like a multiply or overlay, or any one of these mixing values you want to toy around with here. And since we have the image texture coming in here, if we drag this factor value to the left, the farther to the left this is, the more influence the original colors will take. So if we bring this all the way back, that's the original. And the more we bring it over to the right, the more influence of this bottom color goes into this. And so this gives us a little more direct control over adjusting the color. I want to take a second to talk a little bit about the difference between texturing an object like we're doing right now and texture painting. So if we switch this from shader back to Blender, and I were to double right click over here and add, say, torus shape or something here, maybe press W to give it some smoothing, we can of course use zero brush and zero brush light to instantly texture paint an object. So if I were to click on the texture paint button with no UV maps, with no materials, with nothing, we can immediately begin texture painting this object that we clicked on with the zero brush or zero brush light menu here. And I could say, rather than using an image texture, load a texture brush such as the same image I was just using and begin to paint that onto this object. Different situations are going to call for different methods of doing things, and we're going to be discussing a lot more on ZeroBrush in tutorials coming up soon. So if we were doing it this way, we would have immediate control over bump values, which of course we can only see while doing a render preview. So we could either press Shift-Z or press our render preview button straight from there. And whereas we had to set up nodes and things for our cube, ZeroBrush builds node systems for us so we could, turn up reflectivity of this, turn up this bump value, maybe turn down this roughness a little bit. So for the most part, ZeroBrush and ZeroBrush Lite are aspects of Blender that we use to texture paint our objects from the ground up. Basically start with a blank canvas and paint textures onto our objects. This is a different process than trying to use a predefined image and create UV maps that fit the image to work right with the object ahead of time. So I just want you to be aware that there's a difference between painting something from the ground up like this and then trying to get an image that already exists onto an object, sort of like we were doing with the cube. And there will be a lot more tutorials covering ZeroBrush here in the future. But for now, I'm going to press this button, which takes us back to object mode, and press Shift-Z to get out of our render preview and just tap X to delete that. Let's talk about getting images with transparent backgrounds onto our cycles materials. So to start, let's go ahead and open up our internet browser, and let's just find a transparent PNG to use for this. So we could just type in transparent PNG images, which you can see I had already done there, and click on images here and just pick any one of these transparent PNGs you want. I'm going to go ahead and use this giant world here, and I'm going to press view image, and then I'm going to right click this and save image as desktop here. Just call this Earth, I guess. Press save. Okay. This time, we're just going to double right click and use a plane, or you could use any other object you want, doesn't really matter. So we got to do the same things here in the Cycles render engine. Let's give this a new material, and let's go ahead and rename this material to Earth material, I guess. Then over in the node editor, all we need to do is plug in a image texture into this diffuse shader here. So the color value to the color value here, and open that up. And I save that to my desktop, so I want to get to that location and select that picture we just downloaded. Right now, of course, we can't see it because there's no UV map on the object, so let's switch this back to 3D view, press tab to go into edit mode here, and under our edge tools, we can just select unwrap. Of course, if you were dealing with a more complex object, you may need to actually mark seams and actually deal with the UV map here in the image editor. You may need to, move that around, rotate things, scale, what have you. But for something as simple as a plane, usually just a direct unwrap works for us pretty well. The next thing we need to happen here is if we press render preview, we can see this giant picture of the Earth, and if I press G to grab it, move it over. However, the areas of the plane that are white, we can't see through, and we want to be able to see through them. So to fix this, all we need to do is head to the node editor, and we need to add a mix shader. So I'm just going to put this above my material output and plug that in place of that original diffuse. And of course this goes black because there's no actual color information coming into our master material output here, so it doesn't know what to do other than make it black. And then so we need to mix this diffuse with a transparency shader. So we got this transparent here. We would just bring this in here. That gets us half there, only what's happening now is this mix shader is displaying half of this transparent node and half of this diffuse node, which just gives us an overall sort of translucent mix of this. So if we were to press render preview, we can sort of see through it, but we can sort of see through all of it, which is not what we want. We just want these areas around the edges to be gone. So to do that, what we want to use is the alpha control of this image texture. So what that's going to do is use the alpha information, the areas of the image that are see-through and invisible. We want that value to control who gets the transparency and who doesn't with this mix shader. So now if we press render preview, you can see it's sort of working opposite to what we want to do there. So to get that to work properly, all we need to do is change which node is running into which shader socket here. So switch this from here to this one up there, and vice versa. Now we have this material properly displaying only the image part of our transparent PNG. So if we go ahead and switch this back to 3D view, and I can press tab to go back into object mode. And as I'm spinning around here in the 3D view, you can actually see the physical light system that is manifested from the quick lights, which only shows up when you're doing a render preview by pressing this button, or when you do an actual render by pressing this button. We could duplicate this earth a bunch of times, and we can see in all instances the transparent parts of the transparent PNG are properly transparent, which is good. All right, so that about wraps us up for this video, just sort of a basic introduction into getting image textures onto Cycles materials. Hope you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for much more.